Hello people, I am back today with more Good Omens content, because apparently that's what you all want to see, and frankly I am not complaining, I adore this show. So today we're going to be discussing various fan theories, most of which have arisen in the wake of Season 2, and I'm gonna dissect them a little bit and work out how likely I think any of them are. I'll admit now I'm probably going to be debunking most of these to some extent, but I'm not ruling anything out necessarily, and there is one at the end that actually I kind of think might be right. So let's get into it. Today I am drawing Crowley and AziRAPHALE reuniting under an awning, because apparently I like pain, and I feel like Crowley deserves this. And whilst I do that drawing, I'm going to talk about those theories. We're going to be covering 5 theories today. It was going to be 6, but I saw how ridiculously long this script was getting, and decided to cut the "is Maggie secretly a demon" theory, although I'm happy to share my thoughts on that in the comments if anyone wants to hear. And so if there's one particular theory that you want to see, I will hopefully have remembered to use the description to mark the chapters in, and so you can have a look there and jump to the correct point in the video for the theory you want to see, or you can just listen to all of them. They're not ranked in terms of popularity or how likely they are or anything, just in terms of what made the most sense in terms of scripting this video. Also, it goes without saying that there will be Season 2 spoilers in here, like, immediately. So I'm going to start out with the coffee theory, both because I think it's the most widespread and popular one, but also because I sort of already covered it in my Season 2 ending breakdown. So this theory essentially says that the Metatron put a miracle on the coffee that he buys for AziRAPHALE that effectively brainwashed him into choosing heaven over Crowley. It wasn't his conscious decision, he was forced to pick that. The main evidence for this is how weird it was that he did buy coffee for AziRAPHALE, several miracle noises that you can hear on the soundtrack, and the change in description from him saying it has a dash of almond in when he orders it, to a hefty jigger of almond syrup when he gives it to AziRAPHALE. And also then AziRAPHALE's smile in the lift at the end of the episode, as well as other supposedly out-of-character behaviour, such as, abandoning Crowley for heaven. Now, I've already done a whole video breaking down how and why Crowley and AziRAPHALE made their decisions in episode 6, and why for me it does feel like it is in character for them. So here I want to mainly address the physical evidence to support this theory, rather than the kind of, is it in character for them to have done this thing? That said, a lot of these theories touch on AziRAPHALE's slightly creepy smile in the lift, so I'll just go over that first. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm autistic. I don't have an actual diagnosis, but I fit a whole load of criteria, and as such, I am not always good with facial expressions. However, to me, that smile in the lift has always looked very forced, hence why it seems so unnatural and creepy to a lot of people. And I've always personally read it's the sort of face you make when you're trying very hard to pretend that you're okay and that everything is fine, and just put on a brave front. And also the sort of smile you might make when you're trying very hard to convince yourself you've done the right thing. But realistically, you know you probably haven't. But obviously, it is open to interpretation, and I might not be right about that. And lots of people have said different things about this smile, whether they think it's because they swap places, or whether they think it's because he's kind of becoming more brainwashed to be more like Gabriel was before he met Beelzebub, all those sorts of things. So instead, let's move on to the more concrete stuff. I'm going to start with the miracle sounds on the soundtrack. In fact, I re-watched the end of episode 6 before making this video, specifically to listen for these sounds so I could give an accurate analysis, and weirdly, I couldn't find one of them. I swear the last time I watched this show, I could hear one around the time that the Metatron offers to make Crowley an angel again, i.e. roughly when AziRAPHALE seems like he might actually turn him down. He's like, well, I don't want to go to heaven, and immediately the Metatron offers to make Crowley an angel, and I thought there was a miracle sound there, and this time when I listened specifically for it and replayed it several times, I couldn't hear it. There is a slight sound in the background, but it sounds more like the brakes of like a bike squealing or something, and it's so quiet that I'm not sure it was... I think it's just there for like ambiance and background sounds, but I could be wrong. And honestly, I swear it was clearer last time. The second time I watched it, I was listening for these miracle sounds, having heard about this theory, and I could have sworn I heard one there. So let's assume that I've suddenly gone slightly deaf, or I'm hallucinating or something, and it was there, and that sound was there. This would be pretty compelling evidence, as using a miracle only when AziRAPHALE seems to resist would be a logical move, sensible thing to do, Although, as I said in my previous video, AziRAPHALE changing his mind only when Crowley is included in the deal also makes a lot of sense for his character and is something that might have changed his mind on his own without any miraculous intervention. The second miracle noise, however, and I think there are only two, is heard as the Metatron says the words, "Second Coming," which, big deal that. However, I don't think that that is a miracle that was used on AziRAPHALE, and I was looking for this specifically when I went back and watched it, because I had an idea. And what I noticed is that when AziRAPHALE and the Metatron crossed the street to where the lift was earlier in the episode and in episode 5, all the lights and the lights in the door of the Dirty Donkey are all turned off, including the ones that are behind the door where the lift appears. It's all dark. Immediately after the Metatron says "Second Coming," and we hear the miracle noise, you can see him about to step into the elevator, and the lights are on, and they're really bright, heavenly white lights behind those windows. There's also a door opening sound, which I suppose is just him opening the door to the lift, but the fact that this coincides almost directly after the miracle sound makes me think that actually this wasn't a miracle he was using on AziRAPHALE, but it was him summoning the lift, as we see Muriel do in episode 5. Now, I can't be 100% certain, because the lights being off may have been a continuity error, but I do think that this is much more likely than this was an instant where he used a miracle on AziRAPHALE, particularly as AziRAPHALE had almost made up his mind by this point. He'd already gotten this far. I don't think another miracle at this point to use to manipulate AziRAPHALE would have been worth doing. So I'm pretty sure that one is the sound of the lift. The fact that it coincides with the word "Second Coming" both fits in terms of the timeline of him summoning the lift, but also probably was designed intentionally to draw attention to those words and make them sound more impactful, and so the audience focuses on them because that's obviously what Season 3 is going to be about. But the last major piece of evidence is the almond syrup coffee, and this, I'll admit, is a bit suspicious. Namely because I like coffee, but I have never actually been to a single coffee shop anywhere in the UK that offers almond syrup. Almond milk, sure. Hazelnut syrup, yes. Almond syrup, no. The theory goes that whatever miracle he does to the coffee might have changed the flavour, I suppose, so the idea is that maybe miracles taste like almond, and that's why he changes the way he describes the flavour of the coffee? Now, if this is true, it's not actually linked to the miracle noises we might hear on the soundtrack, because he gives the coffee to AziRAPHALE, and AziRAPHALE drinks the coffee long before we hear either of those sounds. Which would suggest that if he did anything to change the makeup of the coffee, it happened off-screen as he was crossing the road back to the bookshop, and we wouldn't have seen it at all. And whilst I will admit that the Metatron is clearly up to no good, and this is going to come back tons because lots of these theories are about the Metatron doing things, and I definitely agree that he is suspicious in every manner, and he's definitely manipulated AziRAPHALE emotionally in this last scene, I'm not sure if even he could perform the sort of complete brainwash miracle some people are suggesting. Whilst Crowley and AziRAPHALE do perform a miracle that works on angels by hiding Gabriel from them, AziRAPHALE is also shown this season to have trouble performing a miracle to brainwash Nina and Maggie into leaving the bookshop when it's under siege. The Metatron is extremely powerful, but the idea that he could manage to completely brainwash another angel, when your average angel can't always do that with humans, doesn't sit right with me. AziRAPHALE also talks about not being able to miracle people into falling in love. You can't change their emotions, and so the idea that the Metatron has somehow miracled AziRAPHALE to make him want to leave Crowley doesn't really sit right with me. I would buy that he maybe subtly influenced AziRAPHALE towards heaven, or maybe subtly influenced him away from caring about his worldly goods, his books, his fine food, etc. But I think at least some element of AziRAPHALE's choice had to be his own decision, because the idea that he's being completely brainwashed just doesn't seem to add up. And like many of the theories that I'm planning on covering today, this is one where, if the theory is true, it would take away all of AziRAPHALE's autonomy and actually make for a much less interesting story, in my opinion. Season 3 would have so much less impact if we found out that AziRAPHALE never meant to leave at all and was only forced to leave. It kind of gives him a fast pass to forgiveness and takes away from all the emotional catharsis and potential character development that he might have. If this wasn't his decision, then there's nowhere for him to grow further in Season 3. So whilst it's a fun idea for fanfic, and I am looking forward to reading some fix-it-fix based on coffee theory, I think it would actually damage the integrity of the story and the potential development and changes if it was true. Next, we have the swap theory. This is, as the name suggests, the theory that sometime during their argument at the end of episode 6, there is a missing scene where Crowley and AziRAPHALE swapped places, similar to how they did in season 1, and that the following breakup that they went through was staged. The main evidence for this is the clock in the background of that scene, which seems to keep time pretty well, apparently, throughout the show. It's really difficult for me to read, and I'm bad at reading analog clocks, so I didn't look at this as closely as I did for listening to the miracle sounds, so I'm trusting the person who posted this to have gotten it right. But supposedly that clock seems to keep track relatively well, and shows time moving forward in a completely reasonable manner as the angels leave the bookshop, and as Nina and Maggie show up, and then as AziRAPHALE returns. It moves forward in what you would assume is about the right amount of time, chronologically speaking. But then for some reason, it jumps forwards by about 25 minutes during that fight that AziRAPHALE and Crowley have. Now, somebody did ask Neil Gaiman about this, which is how I heard about the theory in the first place, and he said it was probably a continuity error. But as we know, authors lie, and the use of the word probably is suspicious as anything, so we're gonna just dig into it a bit more. This theory is further supported by both AziRAPHALE's unnerving grin in the lift to heaven again at the end of the episode, and the fact that Crowley drives past the bookshop when he's leaving very slowly, which is something we've never seen him do before. You also can't see the underside of Crowley's collar at any point after he leaves the bookshop, which doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it doesn't help us disprove it either, because we can't check to see if it's red or tartan, although you would think that AziRAPHALE would have learnt from last time to just leave the collar the way it is. And as we know, this isn't the first time they've done this, and it could be a fun tie-in to season 1 to have them pull the same trick again. However, the main motivation for this would be because they've decided to trick the Metatron to stop Heaven's plans. But AziRAPHALE doesn't actually hear the words second coming until long after the fight, and whilst he may have decided that anything Heaven is planning can't be good, particularly when they're big plans as the Metatron describes them, he would have no idea of the extent of the problem, and in my opinion probably not a good enough idea to decide that he needed to stage a fight and separate himself from Crowley for this. There's also the matter of the conversation itself. They were both crying, and AziRAPHALE seemed so conflicted both during and after the fight that if they did swap, then Crowley must be one hell of an actor to pull that off. Not to mention, I can't see any reason why they would choose to stage their first kiss like that on purpose, unless they swapped after the kiss, which I'm pretty sure whoever was talking about the clocks changing, it changed sometime before the kiss or very close to it. And there's just no reason they would need to take it to that extreme when they didn't even know for sure if Metatron or Muriel were watching, and their fight would have been perfectly believable without that kiss in there. I also feel like Crowley's slow driving can easily be explained away as him giving AziRAPHALE as much time as possible to change his mind, similar to how after the fight he waited by the car rather than driving just straight off and leaving him to get in the lift. He watches him leave, and I think he's trying to give him as much time to change his mind and come back to him as possible. Of course, I'm not completely ruling this out. This is preferable to me to the coffee theory, because if they both have their own autonomy, the idea that they might have switched places has a lot of implications for how AziRAPHALE is Crowley and Crowley and AziRAPHALE are now going to move going forward now that they have effectively swapped sides, and I think learning more about each other's sides could give them some character development, although I don't think it would be as good as the character development that we'll get from them having actually broken up. Next, however, we have the lie theory, which actually deals with some of those inconsistencies that I mentioned previously about whether or not Crowley would be able to act and about whether they would act that well. And this is the theory that AziRAPHALE purposefully lied to Crowley to push him away to protect him from Heaven. This still does have the same problem of him not knowing what Heaven's plan was until right before he stepped into the lift, but I do think it's possible he might have decided that the Metatron offering him a job was a sign that they might both be in danger again and he wanted to protect Crowley from that danger, or possibly just even to maintain the existence of their side that's protecting humanity, even if that side is going to become just Crowley as a consequence of this. He also might have decided to do this because he feels it's his responsibility to bring Heaven down from the inside. This would of course all mean that the argument from Crowley's side was 100% genuine. He actually believed that AziRAPHALE was leaving him, and all of his reactions were natural, including the kiss. And from AziRAPHALE's side, the conflict that we can see during this argument would still be there if he knew he was hurting Crowley on purpose. He might decide to change his mind and maybe clue Crowley in, but he keeps fighting that impulse because he wants to keep him safe. And so the way that they interact with one another and the angstiness and pure pain of that fight would be much more realistic. It would just be the intentions behind the fight that were different. However, AziRAPHALE is also known for being really bad at lying. He gets nervous, he makes really obvious facial expressions when we've seen him lying to angels in the past, and I'm not sure if this matches up with how well he supposedly lies to Crowley. In the past, the only reason he's not been caught out for his lies is because Heaven is naive as anything and they do not seem to notice. But here, his lying is so convincing that I don't think it adds up, and also I couldn't find anything that he says in that speech that feels like it might be something he's leaving as a clue for Crowley to work out that he's lying, which is something that you think he would do if he was trying to push him away to keep him safe. Particularly though, it's how excited he seems when he first tells Crowley about the job offer. I'm not sure that he could fake that level of excitement if he was so scared for Crowley's safety. Also, similar to the coffee theory, I feel like this makes AziRAPHALE's potential character arc and potential development much less interesting than it could have been, as although this isn't as easy a fix for him as having been brainwashed, it does make him a whole lot easier to forgive, and it doesn't give AziRAPHALE as much place to grow because, once again, he already knows which side he's on, as opposed to him having to properly learn that and choose to push Heaven away himself in Season 3. So, similar to the swap theory, this is one where I wouldn't hate it if this was true, but I think there are better options, and I think, once again, the fight being genuine makes for a more interesting story. Next, I'm covering the big one. I've had a couple of people ask about this, and this is the magic trick you didn't see theory, which is essentially the theory that the Metatron has been meddling with the Book of Life and retroactively changing Crowley and AziRAPHALE's history and rewriting parts of it so that they think that it's their fault that they've pushed each other away, when actually it was his doing all along. Now, from a technical point of view, this is very interesting. The Book of Life is repeatedly mentioned throughout Season 2, but never used. In fact, we don't actually ever get any proof that it's even real. So the idea that this book is going to play a big part in Season 3 makes a whole lot of sense to me. I also think that there's lots of evidence that the Metatron is up to no good, as I said before, and is in fact actively trying to separate AziRAPHALE and Crowley, or at least get them where he can keep an eye on them, and has been planning something like this, and by this I mean the job offer he gives to AziRAPHALE, since at least they performed the 25 Lazari miracle together, if not since before the failed apocalypse the first time. However, I have a lot of issues with this theory, specifically the big Google document version of it, both in the practicality and in the way that the defense of the theory is written. Now, the person who wrote this document is supposedly a professional author, which I'm not able to check because the document is anonymous, who has been published multiple times. I am not. I am an animation student who has done one module on media studies, and it was a specifically animation and film media studies, and therefore I do not know everything. I am not qualified. They are definitely more qualified than I am. This is all just my opinion from, like I said, that one module I did and lots of watching TV. But I'm going to give you my opinion anyways, and if you decide you disagree with me, well then you can absolutely go, I'm unqualified and I don't know what I'm talking about. But this is what I thought and felt whilst reading that. Firstly, the way this document is written really icks me out. The first few pages basically seem to say that the writing in Season 2 is objectively bad, and the ending is unsatisfying, but Neil Gaiman is clever, so surely it's intentional. Now, I don't think the writing is bad. I think it has a different pacing to Season 1, and there are more loose ends, but that's kind of an inevitable consequence of it being a bridging season meant to lead to Season 3. I also didn't find the ending at all unsatisfying. Heartbreaking, yes, I did cry. But it was beautiful. And as my sister pointed out to me, and she's much less invested in Good Omens, she's a very casual viewer, it made a whole lot of sense for the season to end with them breaking up, because it couldn't end the same way Season 1 did. That would be repetitive. It has to show something different for it to lead into a different kind of Season 3. But aside from my personal opinion, on the writing of Good Omens Season 2, this person is suggesting that Neil Gaiman intentionally wrote poorly to clue us into an extremely subtle greater plot that wouldn't be revealed for at least the next 2 to 3 years, if it ever gets made at all. Now, from a financial perspective alone, and I studied economics, so I can talk on this one, this seems really odd. Why would you risk your audience thinking you had bad writing for a whole season without ever taking a moment to reveal what was really going on, or at least plant a slightly more obvious clue, just on the chance that you might get another season to prove them wrong? Heck, I'm not even sure that you would want to take that approach for a whole episode, because people might just assume that it actually is bad writing and stop watching. You'd be actively harming your own viewing numbers and reducing the chance of you getting a third season, and no payoff is worth it if you don't get the chance to actually write the payoff. There is also, though, a number of different moments they use as evidence for this supposed bad writing, talking about how there seems to be tons of setup and no payoff in this season. And I read through most of them, and I found that some of these places I think that they've missed the point of what the payoff was supposed to be. Some, I think, are just set up for Season 3, and so we will find out when we get there, which I suppose is the point of this theory, is they're implying that it's all set up for a greater theory in Season 3, but some of it, I think, is just kind of prompting things for Season 3. And some of it, I will admit, is slightly odd, and I don't entirely get it. The first point that comes up, though, is that Maggie and Nina's story seems like perfect setup for a classic, slightly cliché romance, but they don't get together at the end, and that apparently feels like a loose end. Well, from where I'm sitting, we got an adorable romance with a grounded, realistic but hopeful ending, and also there was a great point made about not meddling in other people's relationships and how that can cause problems for them. I liked that the ending wasn't a quick fix, where they lived happily ever after, and so, as far as I'm concerned, I got to have my cake and eat it too. It's very much implied, I think, in that ending that Nina and Maggie are going to get together one day, just not yet, and I like that ending. It felt complete, it felt satisfying. I'm not actually expecting Nina and Maggie to show up again in Season 3, because I think their story is done. But if you didn't find it satisfying, you didn't find it satisfying, I suppose. Then there's various points about the flashbacks and how they don't actually seem to help in solving the mystery. And I agree that they don't, and I talked about this a little bit in my other video. But that's because I believe instead they are meant to highlight the way that AziRAPHALE and Crowley's relationship has changed, and specifically how AziRAPHALE has grown as a character. I noticed in a past rewatch that all of the flashbacks, except possibly the scene in the beginning of episode 1, appear to be specifically AziRAPHALE's memories. It always cuts to him after coming out of those flashbacks, or it's him who sees something that reminds him of them. And I think this is to further help highlight his growth. He's wrestling with his morality the entire season, and this kind of helps to frame that. There's also a point made about the characters within those flashbacks, such as Elspeth and the Nazi characters, and how their stories seemed a little open-ended, and I find that an odd point to bring up, because they're short stories, and I think they each make their point pretty well. The Elspeth episode is all about morality and how inequality makes it harder or easier to choose the right thing, and her ending involves her finally getting the money she needs to choose to be good, and kind of proving AziRAPHALE wrong about his whole, well, poverty gives you more choices thing. It allows her to grow and allows AziRAPHALE to see how much difference that makes to her. As a short story of just about her, I feel like that's sufficient. If we'd only ever seen that one snapshot, if it was just a short story about a grave-robbing girl who meets an angel and a demon and how they change her life, that would be a satisfying ending to me. Similarly with the Nazis, the entire episode is about trust and learning who you can trust, and AziRAPHALE realising he can trust Crowley. And the Nazis discover that they can't trust a demon, despite the fact that they're arguably on the same side of, yay, let's stab everybody. But AziRAPHALE discovers that he can trust Crowley because he knows Crowley, and they spent so long together, despite the fact that Crowley and him are on opposite sides, and I think this contrast works really well together. There's also probably a point in the Nazi story as well about being careful what you wish for, but once again, as a short story, I think it works. I think this one's possibly a little bit more ambiguous because we've met the characters from before now, so the idea that we're continuing their story kind of implies that there might be something more to it and some commentary on those characters specifically, but I still think it works alright. Then there's the Gabriel statue. I don't know why this is suspicious to the writer of this theory, because they talk about how it keeps coming up and never anything seems to happen with it, but I think it works quite well, and it's one of the few clues that actually does link to Gabriel's mystery, which is supposedly the major mystery of the season. And you can see on a second rewatch why, for instance, Beelzebub seems so certain that it would be perfectly logical for Gabriel to actually be in Edinburgh when Shax is debating where Gabriel really is, because, of course, Beelzebub visited the statue with Gabriel. I think it's just meant to be kind of a fun little thing. There's a weird statue that looks a lot like Gabriel, and both Crowley and AziRAPHALE and Gabriel and Beelzebub have seen that statue, and the different conclusions they draw, and it is very fun. I don't think it needs to have some greater point. It helps them figure out the mystery, or at least it helps the audience figure out the mystery a bit, and it's funny because Gabriel is exceedingly vain. There was also a point in this theory somewhere about how Gabriel supposedly never gave AziRAPHALE the thing that was meant to stop something terrible happening, and like, I could have sworn that was just the box. Like, I swear the thing was the box, or more accurately, the fly inside the box. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that that's what that was, and that was completely wrapped up. I don't think that's a loose end. I think that's just, the thing was the box. They never exactly confirmed that the thing was the box, but I thought it was pretty heavily implied. Next, however, there's the vanishing Eccles cakes, which get focused on and then completely disappear, and then in episode 5, Nina erases them from the menu. This is admittedly very odd, but someone put something in my comments a while back, I think, about this idea of Crowley and AziRAPHALE having routines and rituals of a sort in season 1, such as getting to dinner together, sitting in the park, etc., none of which they seem to do in season 2. In fact, the only thing AziRAPHALE eats at all in this season is in the flashback with Job, and a travel sweet that he eats in the car. And this breaking of their rituals and routines is meant to kind of clue the audience into the fact that not everything is perfect in their relationship, and that there are cracks and that there are issues. And whilst this is also just a theory, it makes a lot more sense to me than this idea that the vanishing Eccles cakes are somehow a sign of the Metatron rewriting various arguments and moments throughout the story. Finally, I think there is a mention in this theory of how God is no longer narrating this season, and that suggests that a lot of the narration in the season is unreliable. And whilst I suspect we may find out that there is an in-world reason for the lack of narration from God, I think the main reason outside of the universe for this is that most of the narration that God does in season 1 is taken directly from the book, and the non-book pieces in season 1, such as the flashbacks in the episode 3 cold open, and I'm pretty sure the trial at the end of episode 6, weren't narrated, and the reason they weren't narrated is because they're not in the book, and therefore the prose to go with them isn't there. And so the idea that God is not narrating season 2 makes a lot of sense to me, because there is no second book. But I suppose we'll have to see, and there may very well be a reason for this that is kind of more complex than what my brain's taking it for. But the biggest gripe that I have with this theory specifically is the implications it would have if it turned out to be true. Firstly, if the Metatron had been subtly manipulating the Book of Life to slowly separate Crowley and AziRAPHALE by making them think it was their own choice to separate, why on earth would he not have just rewritten them so that they never met? Surely that would be easier than kind of subtly pushing them apart to make them doubt each other and think they don't care about each other, than just, well, what if they never met? Or what if they did meet but they split up long before Armageddon? Why not, in fact, just rewrite Armageddon so that it actually happened? There's too much power with the book, and I can't see why he wouldn't have done any of those things, or what the in-world reason for not choosing those options instead could have been. And if he has been subtly manipulating the world and erasing bits of history, that then causes a bigger problem, because this theory is founded on the idea that the writing seems bad, but much worse than any loose thread or odd moment would be to claim that none of it ever happened. If the story goes in this direction, it would be telling the entire audience not to trust anything we can see or anything we ever have seen in this show. Because how can we know that anything we've seen, any moment that these characters have shared, any adorable, happy moment, any angsty moment, anything at all, is real, when it can just be overwritten by the Metatron like that? even if we get an itemised list of the things he's changed and the scenes he's changed, we would never know for sure. And why should we care about anything that's happening in this show if it might have never been real? There's a trend at the minute of various cinematic universes and TV shows bringing in this idea of a multiverse. And whilst it can occasionally be done very, very well, it so often just kind of makes you go, well, why should we care? Because they can just hop over to another universe where everything's fine again. And whilst I don't think they're implying that there would be multiple universes as a result of this in Good Omens, it is suggesting that none of Good Omens is necessarily real and it might have been rewritten. They're changing the timeline and changing history retroactively. This theory does make some good points, and I can see how much time and energy must have gone into it and into compiling that document, and I do really admire that. I haven't spent as much time on this video as I'm sure they spent on that theory. But what this theory seems to be trying to do is fix what they're seeing as bad writing with writing that would be so much worse, that would wreck the entirety of our suspension of disbelief, and I just can't buy into it. The idea that none of it was real, it just messes with my brain, and I don't think it would work in this universe specifically. You're perfectly entitled, of course, to not like some of the narrative choices made this season, and in fact you're perfectly entitled to believe in this theory if you want to, but for me, it just is not the right answer. It can't be. Now after all that, which was kind of... that theory is a lot, let's put it that way. I spent more time, I think, debunking that theory than I did on all of the others. But I finally want to touch on an old classic and a couple of its variants that I haven't always supported, but has been growing on me a lot recently. And that is the what if Crowley used to be an Archangel theory. Now this theory has been around since season 1 came out, possibly before that, and whilst I am usually much more in favour of the idea that Crowley and AziRAPHALE are both pretty average and normal, and thereby making their impact on the world seem so much more impressive because they were just ordinary angels, there is admittedly a lot of evidence to support this theory. In season 1, the evidence is mostly the fact that Crowley is the Serpent of Eden, a role that is biblically associated with the devil himself, thereby implying Crowley must have been pretty high up and high ranked to get that job in the first place, and his status probably carried over from before the fall, hence he was ranked highly and ended up with this job. In season 1, Crowley is also the only demon who isn't constantly covered in grime and lizards and insects, which might imply something sets him apart from the others, although I did always attribute this to his time on Earth, and the existence of Shax in season 2, who looks very put together and neat and not covered in grime and lizards, would suggest that yes, his time on Earth is what has this effect rather than some former angelic status. The other big thing, though, in season 1 is that at the beginning of episode 6, Crowley stops time, not just for humanity, but he delays the arrival of the devil themselves all on his own, which suggests he has a whole lot of power to be able to do that and to be able to have an effect on such a wide area. I'm pretty sure he stops time across the whole Earth, but he specifically stops it in the airbase, and he stops Lucifer arriving. Season 2 only backs this theory up, of course. Crowley is predominantly in charge of an entire nebula when he's an angel. He is confirmed to have been at least a throne or a dominion or above when he opens the file on Gabriel in Muriel's office. And AziRAPHALE, who I don't know if they're an archangel, but they're certainly high enough to be working with the archangels in the present day, remembers having worked with him on some of his nebulas, despite the fact that he doesn't seem to remember them at all, implying that working with someone who's equivalent to an archangel was not really a big deal for him at all. Of course, there is also a theory that Crowley doesn't maintain his memories after the fall, but AziRAPHALE only introduces himself to Crowley before the fall and not in Eden, so I assume he kept some of them since he seems to know exactly who AziRAPHALE is. There's also a weird cut to Crowley's face during Gabriel's trial when Gabriel says that he's the only First Order Archangel in the universe. I still wouldn't say for sure that Crowley was an archangel specifically necessarily, but there is certainly a whole lot of evidence to suggest that he was pretty powerful and high up before the fall. Which begs the question, if he was an archangel, which one was he? Now personally, I don't think we will ever find out, and I don't particularly want to find out. Crowley is Crowley. He chose that name for himself, and whoever he was before doesn't matter. He's not the angel we knew anymore. I personally find Crowley's name to be a really nice kind of trans allegory of sorts. He chose one that fit him, that wasn't given to him by heaven and wasn't given it to him by hell. And whoever he was before that is long gone and should be irrelevant. We don't tend to go around calling him Crowley in the fandom because he's not Crowley, he's Crowley, and I feel like we should treat his angel name the same way. That said, let's discuss what the options are, because some of these are interesting. Now, some people have been saying, because of the whole Serpent of Eden thing, and the First Order Archangel moment, that Crowley might have been Lucifer. And whilst this is very, very cool, Neil Gaiman has confirmed that Satan and Lucifer are the same person in the Good Omens universe, and since we see Satan in Season 1 at the same time as Crowley, I'm gonna say this is probably not right. Of course, Neil Gaiman could be lying, again, authors lie, but unlike when he responded to the clock jumping, he didn't use the word probably, so I am going to trust him here and say that they are the same person. I've also seen, however, the name Kokabeel tossed around in various pieces of fanfic. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, which as far as I can tell comes from the fact that in biblical mythology, Kokabeel was a fallen angel who was known as the Angel of the Stars before they fell. Crowley built nebulas, you can sort of see where this is going. I don't think this one is ever likely to be confirmed because, like I said, it's sort of irrelevant exactly what name he has, and Kokabeel isn't a well enough known angelic name to have any major impact on the plot, so clarifying that this is who he was kind of feels unnecessary, but it is a fun theory, and it would make a lot of sense. The final theory, and I believe the most popular one, is that Crowley was Raphael. Raphael is the angel of healing, which doesn't necessarily seem to have any links to Crowley at all. There's nothing he does that's particularly healy or medicine-y based at any point in either of the two seasons we've got so far. And Raphael doesn't actually have any link to the stars as far as I can tell. However, he is the only major archangel to have never appeared in the show, the others being Michael, Gabriel, and Uriel. There's also 7 major archangels, but that includes a bunch that we've not seen before, but of the 4 main ones, Raphael is the only one to not appear yet. He's also depicted often with a staff with like a snake on top of it. It's a symbol you might have seen outside of hospitals before, like the little snake with the wings. And since Crowley is a snake, you sort of get the idea. This theory is kind of circumstantial, though. There's not much to link Raphael to Crowley specifically, other than this weirdness of why isn't there a Raphael in this world? So I don't know how much I buy it. I did also, however, get someone in my comments mentioning a theory that I want to touch on here, that AziRAPHALE instead used to be Raphael, and has at some point been demoted. The main evidence being that if you knock the Azi off the front of his name, it pretty much spells Raphael, and supposedly one of Raphael's aliases was Azaria, which kind of sounds like AziRAPHALE. Now, there's nothing to suggest that AziRAPHALE has ever been demoted, and the other archangels have mocked and belittled him since the beginning, which would suggest that he's always been beneath them. Not to mention that in the beginning of Season 2, Crowley asks for AziRAPHALE's help holding his piece of paper in a manner that kind of implies AziRAPHALE is the guy who gets the coffee. And whilst I don't think that Crowley is trying to belittle him, it does suggest that AziRAPHALE is underneath Crowley, somewhere in the angelic hierarchy. But of course, as I was considering this theory that someone put in the comments, I realised I wouldn't put it past Neil Gaiman to have done this just to kind of go, ha, you thought it was Crowley, well, you were wrong. Which is when somebody put a different comment down below under my poll for this video, suggesting, what if AziRAPHALE didn't used to be Raphael, but is about to become Raphael now that he's the Supreme Archangel? It would both explain why Raphael has never been mentioned, and take us all for a spin given how many people thought it was Crowley. And so I really like this idea. It would be similar to how sometimes the English monarch, when they become king or queen, would choose a specific name for themselves that's associated with that station. It hasn't happened the last couple of times, but I know for a fact, I think with some of the historic King Georges, their name wasn't actually George until they became king. As the idea of AziRAPHALE taking on this mantle would make a lot of sense, and equally with Raphael being the angel of healing, AziRAPHALE is trying to heal heaven, fix heaven, and protect the earth. It just tracks really well, and I think it could be really fun. There's not enough evidence to support it, but I would enjoy this. So, thank you all so much for watching this video. Well done if you made it to the end. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a like, and I would love to hear all of your thoughts on these theories and any of your own you might have down below in the comments. With that said though, I hope you have a lovely day, and I will see you all soon. Bye.